So as you saw, we have gathered a huge amount of neuroscientific knowledge. Now, this knowledge can be represented very simply into what neurons do, what is their dynamics, and we use the very simplest models for the neurons. Very simple single compartment integrated fire models with a leak, wherein a neuron receives input from about 10,000 neighboring and distant neurons. It integrates this input. If the input reaches a threshold, it emits an all or nothing binary or a digital spike, and otherwise it decays back to a resting state. 80% of the neurons in the cerebral cortex are excitatory, meaning when they fire, they tend to agitate and fire the downstream neurons, and about 20% of the neurons are inhibitory, meaning that when they fire, they inhibit the firing of downstream neurons. So the excitatory are pyramidal cells, the inhibitory are fast spiking cells, so very simple neuron models. And then we use simple models for synapses, which are the edges in the brain network or junctions between the neurons. And we used very simple responses for the synapses, AMPA, NMDA, GABA A, GABA B, which are nothing but differences of two exponentials. So when a neuron fires, the junction between the two has a little nonlinear response, which is shown by the decaying exponentials near the names. The synapse, by the way, is a junction between output line of one neuron called the axon and the input line of another neuron called the dendrite. The conduction on the axon is electrical. The conduction on the dendrite is chemical. But the synapse, conduction on the dendrite is also electrical, but the synapse is actually not a physical contact, but a cleft. And the conduction from axon to the dendrite through the synapse is chemical, which is how this operates. And the synapse is presumed to have a weight. And it is the adaptation of this weight that results in learning. And we use a simple algorithm for learning, which is based on Hebb's rule. Neurons that fire together wire together. And then the third is the gray matter canonical cortical circuit data from Binziger, Douglas, and Martin. What this is about 30 years of collection on data on how canonical regions in the cortex are organized. So we take all this data, and the question is, can you put it together into an integrated model? And can you then run simulations to gain an insight into the structure, dynamical, and computational processes that may guide our thinking? So here's a very simple algorithm for the simulation. As I said, neurons are interconnected via a directed graph. It's a discrete event simulation. So the simulation is broken up into time steps. The resolution of the time step is roughly 1 millisecond. And the idea is you run a for loop for all neurons for I equal to 1 to n. And you run a for loop over time steps for j equal to 1 to t. And for every I, every neuron, every time step, you update the state of the neuron. If the neuron fires, you generate an event. Now that event is not a clocked event. Now synapses, you don't run a for loop for k equal to 1 to s. The reason is there are 10,000 times more synapses than there are neurons. You can never carry out a simulation where synapses are in a for loop. So you have to do a completely event-based simulation where a synapse is activated only when it receives a spike. So that's essentially the idea behind how the simulations are run. And in a series of simulations, what you see here is the mouse cerebral cortex, which is about 16 million neurons, 128 billion synapses. Rat is about 4 times bigger. cat is about 15 times bigger, monkey is about 3 times bigger than the cat, and the human is about 10 times bigger. So it's a logarithmic scale. And in December 2006, on a blue gene at IBM Research Almaden, we're able to run a simulation at the scale of 40% of the mouse scale. I must note, with very simple dynamical equations of neurons and synapses. Then in 2007, using a 32,000 processor blue gene, 8 terabytes of RAM, we're able to run a simulation at the scale of the mouse, the rat cerebral cortex. In March 2009, using a supercomputer of KAUST, we're able to run a simulation at 1% of the human cerebral cortex. Then we had access to the Lawrence Livermore National Labs Dawn Blue Gene P supercomputer with about 147,000 processors, 144 terabytes of main memory. And what you see here is the weak scaling result. Weak scaling means as more processors are added, larger model can be simulated. And then these are the strong scaling results, which means for a fixed model, as you increase the number of processors, faster running times can be obtained. Put it all together, in 2009, we were able to run a simulation with about 1 billion neurons, 10 trillion synapses, about 100 times slower than real time. So this really allowed us to truly understand computationally the power consumption of these algorithms. And this simulation had, I can't even count, how many zeros are there? 2 to the 15th or so spikes in about a 1 minute simulated in about 300 minutes. So what happens? What do you see in simulations like this? This is a very simple video. What it sort of shows you, little rectangles you see are different corticothalamic layers, and the upper area is one cortical region, the lower area is another cortical region, and you can see how activity propagates through the simulation. Pretty soon we found that the spatio-temporal resolution of the data that our simulations produced far overran our ability to visualize and understand them. So what we had to do is we began to put together a system of 16 screens, each with 4 million pixels, for the total about 64 million pixels. This corresponds to about rat scale. So the idea would be that each neuron's activity would be represented as on-off of 1 pixel. The brain wall is still undergoing testing. It's not fully working, but I want to show you a video outlining its construction by one of my colleagues, Bill Risk. First video, please. So next time, hopefully, I'll be able to show you a simulation running on the brain wall. Slides, please. So now let's see where the trend is going. On the x-axis, you see the years. On the y-axis, you see the flops in log scale. The lower line is the computing power of the 500th largest supercomputing in the world as a function of the time. The blue line is the computing power of the fastest or the most powerful supercomputing on the world as a function of time. And the top line is the sum of all 500 computers. And they all seem to be pretty much in a straight line. So this is sort of another exponential that underlies our technological progress, which is the scale out in form of supercomputers. And you can see where our cat scale supercomputer simulation ends up. From that, assuming that this line holds up, it stands to reason that within the next decade, a human scale simulation using simple neurons and simple synapses, as I pointed out, seems inevitable. We hope this will be an IBM supercomputer. So now, what's the rub? The problem is the human brain consumes 10 watt for one hemisphere. Such a simulation, of course, we haven't built this supercomputer. It's very hard to project. So any number that I give you is likely to be very wrong. Either it's going to be too high or too low. But with that proviso, just a straightforward, very simple interpolation, giving no cut at all to technological or other design progress that's sure to come, seems about 100 megawatts at least. Okay. So now, if you're working on a problem where the difference between the desired goal and the state of the art is 6 to 7 orders of magnitude at least, that's a good place to be. So that's really the goal of the DARPA Synapse project, is about 1 kilowatt for a system with about 10 to the 14 synapses. And it should fit in a shoebox. That's the goal. So now let me transition to the third leg of this project, which is nanotechnology.